everyone and welcome to lecture 12. In our previous lecture, we learned how a firm can use the idea of where it's operating on the demand curve, i.e. noting what its price elasticity of demand is and trying to understand in which direction the price ought to be changed in order to maximize total revenue, right. So, we looked at the example of a movie theater which was initially charging a uniform price of 35 rupees per ticket and then moved away from this uniform price to charge different prices to the two groups. We call this as price discrimination, right. We will talk more about price discrimination a little later, but for the moment just keep in mind that this is charging different prices to different groups for the same product, right. So, the firm is still selling tickets for its movies and it's charging different prices. Now, towards the end of the lecture, I mentioned that maximizing revenue and maximizing profits are not equivalent. However, in this example, they are equivalent. I just want to spend some time elaborating on this, and then we will move to factors affecting the price elasticity of demand, right. So, sellers normally maximize profit instead of maximizing total revenue. Right. However, in this example, specific for our movie theater example, right, in this example, maximizing total revenue is equivalent to maximizing the profit, right. Let's understand why, right. So normally profit also will come up a little later in the course. In fact, in our next topic of marginal analysis, we are going to look at a firm which is going to be maximizing its profit. So, profit in general is the total revenue minus total cost, right. So, total revenue minus the total cost, right. Normally, if total revenue increases, right, the total cost also increases, right, normally, right. So, if I see that my revenue has increased, why? Because perhaps my sales have increased. So, price times quantity is, let us say demand is on, so we are operating on the elastic portion of the demand curve. I give a discount that translates to a huge increase in sales. So, my revenue increases and so because my Q has increased, the total cost also has increased as output has increased, right. Now, the rate at which the total revenue and total cost change is going to determine whether profit is going to increase or not, right. So, normally if total revenue increases, the total cost also increases, which implies that maximizing the total revenue is not the same as maximizing profit. However, for this movie theater, it really didn't matter, and the reason being that if I look at this total cost expression for a movie theater, so let us ask, what do I expect the total cost for a movie theater to be, right. Now, there are in general the total cost is going to be the sum of a fixed cost and a variable cost. Now, these are things which will come a little later in the course. We will be doing those in detail, but since these expressions and these terms have come up here, I just want to also put it in the current context. Now, so think of any movie theater that you've gone to, right. So, there are going to be fixed costs. The primary costs, the larger portion of the fixed costs would be the rights to screen the movie, right. There would also be a lot of variable costs. So, for example, you are employing people, you are running some small shops outside which are selling some food. So, So that will involve a cost. The rent that the movie theater pays, if it's part of another building or a mall, is also part of the fixed cost. So for a movie theater, this fixed cost component is much larger compared to the variable cost, right? So the fixed cost is much larger in comparison to the variable cost, right? So in fact, the rights to screen the movie itself would be a substantial portion of the cost, right? The rent that you are paying is also going to be on the premises where you have the movie theater, is also going to be a large component of the fixed cost, right? So because the variable cost is relatively smaller, and we are not suggesting that the variable cost is not important, we are saying that in magnitude this is going to be much smaller compared to the fixed cost. So most of the costs is approximately the fixed cost. And by definition, fixed cost does not depend on the quantity, right? Now think of whether there is one person sitting in the movie theater, or let's say there are 500 people sitting in the movie theater, right? So the fixed costs are still are independent of whether there is one person or whether there is 500 people, right? So because the most of the cost is the fixed cost, your profit is total revenue minus sort of the fixed cost, right? So where the larger component is just the fixed cost. So your profit for the movie theater is essentially a total revenue minus a fixed cost, which is a constant number, right? Which is the reason why maximizing total revenue is the same as maximizing the profit. Notice, we are not saying that the magnitude of profit and the magnitude of total revenue are going to be the same. That is not what is being told. What we are saying is that if my objective was maximizing total revenue, that is as good an objective as maximizing profit. Now, I will just make a note that when we talk about marginal analysis, right, in our next topic of marginal analysis, right. So, in our next topic of marginal analysis, we will see an example where maximizing profit and maximizing total revenue are not equivalent. In fact, in that instance, we need to be very precise, we need to be very specific about what the objective is. Is the objective maximizing revenue? Is the objective maximizing profit? You are going to get different answers based on what the objective is. Before we get there, there is just one small part on factors that affect price elasticity of demand. So, let us discuss that before we get into marginal analysis. Factors affecting the price elasticity of demand. Okay. Now, the first important factor which influences the price elasticity of demand, right, is the availability of substitutes. Right. So, if I am thinking of, let us say, this pen, right, if there are more substitutes available for this pen, then think of what happens. If the firm which is manufacturing this pen has raised its price, then as a consumer, I will switch from buying this pen towards some other substitutes. So, if there are many substitutes available, if there are many alternatives available for me, then I am not forced or I am not tied to this particular pen, right. So, when it becomes more expensive, my quantity demanded of this pen will decrease and I will switch towards substitute goods which may be relatively cheaper and I will buy them. So, the demand for this pen will fall by, so once I have substituted towards buying the other goods, the quantity that I'll be buying will fall by a lot, right? So more the number of substitutes available, so more the number of substitutes available, for a particular good, greater is the price elasticity of demand. For that good, right? So the example that I gave was for the pens, right? So when a good has fewer substitutes, so let's say that there are not many substitutes available for this particular pen, right? There are not many substitutes available. So when the firm raises the price, I cannot switch towards consuming other goods, right? I am forced to continue using this particular pen, right? So when a good has fewer substitutes, demand tends to be relatively inelastic. Let me also give one more interesting example, right? So imagine that you are trying to compute the price elasticity of demand for air travel, right? So you are trying to compute price elasticity of demand for air travel, right? And let's say you are trying to compute the price elasticity of demand for air travel for two groups of consumers. One is consumers who are traveling on leisure and consumers who are traveling on, let's say, business. Now, for which of the two groups is demand going to be elastic, demand for air travel going to be elastic, and for which of these two groups is it going to be relatively inelastic? Now, think of it, if you are a leisure traveler and the price of an airline ticket is very high, you have other choices, right? You have other options. You will either look for taking a train, you will look for taking a bus, you will try and look for carpooling. So there are various substitutes available. So when the price of an airline ticket increases and if you are traveling for leisure, you will switch towards other substitutes. You can plan ahead, right? So the fact that you can plan ahead tells us that if the price is very high, you will switch towards other goods. But if you are traveling on business, right? So let's say you have a meeting that you have to attend, let's say in Chennai or Hyderabad, right? And you are traveling from Kanpur. You don't have much choice, right? So you will have to be there at the meeting tomorrow by 10 o'clock. So even if the price of the air ticket is very high, it is not that you can switch towards substitutes because the train is not going to take you there in time for the meeting. So between the two groups, the demand for air travel is going to be more elastic. So the absolute value is going to be, in fact, is going to be a larger number. Let me put it that way. So, demand for leisure traveler. So in fact, in the text, the value of the price elasticity of demand for air travel is estimated. This value turns out to be equal to minus 1.52, and for business travelers it is minus 1.15. Notice the absolute value for both is bigger than 1, right? Relatively, the price elasticity of demand for business travelers is a smaller number than that for leisure travelers, right? So simply, and you would expect the same thing for train travel, whether it's a leisure traveler or whether it's if you're traveling for business, which then tells us that demand tends to be, I can just extend this above argument and also say that demand tends to be more elastic the longer the time period. longer the time period, and is relatively inelastic the shorter the time period. Right. Now, think of, suppose you need to get to the railway station, right. So, in your city, suppose you have to reach the railway station. Let us say you have got to catch a train at let us say 11:30, it is about 10 o'clock. So, you do not have much choice, right. So, you look for a taxi, and even if the fare is higher, the fact that you have got to get to the railway station to catch the train by 11:30 leaves you with a very small time period to search for alternatives, right. So, you can't wait for a bus, right. There are not many alternatives available for you. So, the availability of substitutes is a lot lesser. In contrast, suppose my train is at 5 o'clock in the evening and it is, let us say, 10 o'clock now. I can plan ahead, right. So, I can then search for, I can plan for the mode of travel. So, suppose I know that there is a bus which is going to depart from closer to my place at 2 o'clock, even though it is going to take probably some additional time to take me to the station, I can plan for it, right. So, I have more substitutes available in the longer run compared to the shorter time period, right. So, demand tends to be more elastic the longer the time period and relatively inelastic the shorter the time period, right. So, keep that in mind. The second factor which influences the price elasticity of demand is the expenditure share in the good. Right. So, think of buying a so think of two goods, right. So, let us say you are buying a refrigerator or a television or let us say a washing machine, right. So, suppose you are buying these goods, a refrigerator or a television or a washing machine, versus let us say buying, let us say, a packet of salt or let us say some grocery items, right. Now, look at the expenditure share for these two groups of goods. Now, clearly a refrigerator or a TV or a washing machine is going to comprise a larger share of your total budget. So, you have a budget. So, these goods are going to comprise a larger share of your budget as opposed to, let us say, salt or grocery items, which are going to comprise a smaller share of your budget, right. So, in which of the cases are you going to be more sensitive to a change in the price of the good? Well, in the first case, because think of the extreme case where you are spending your entire budget on let us say a refrigerator, right. You will find that if the price of the refrigerator further increases, you are going to be extremely sensitive towards the change in price, right. In fact, which is also one reason why for some of these goods, refrigerator or a TV or a washing machine, you will shop around a lot, right. You will look for discounts, you will go to multiple stores, you will search the prices of these goods online, you will ask whether there are any rebates available, whether there are any refunds, whether there are discounts available, those kind of issues, right. So, greater the expenditure share of the good in your total budget, the more elastic is the price elasticity of demand, right. So, demand tends to be, so let's write this. So, demand tends to be more price elastic. Demand tends to be more price elastic when a consumer's expenditure share on the good is large, right. So, when the consumer's expenditure share on the good is large, demand tends to be relatively price elastic, right. So, for goods like refrigerator, washing machine, etc., we would expect the price elasticity of demand to be more than 1. So, these are goods which are going to have elastic demand. These are going to be goods which are relatively inelastic, right. So, demand tends to be relatively price inelastic, demand tends to be relatively price inelastic when the expenditure share of the good in the consumer's total budget is relatively small. Right. So we learnt that more the substitutes available for a good, greater is the price elasticity of demand. Greater the expenditure share of the good in your total budget, more is the price elasticity of demand. Right. The third important part is the importance of the good in your budget. Right. So, importance of the good in the consumer's budget. Importance of the good for the consumer, let us say, right. Essentially, is the good a necessity, right? Necessity versus luxury goods, right. So, let me first write it down. So, demand tends to be less price elastic or relatively inelastic when the product is a necessary good, right. So, think of insulin for a diabetes patient, right. So, this is a necessary good. So, even if the price were to increase, the quantity demanded would not decrease, I would still need to use it, correct. So, this is a necessary good. Imagine use of household grocery items, right. A good, for example, milk. So, for many households it is a necessary good, right. So, even if the price were to increase, the quantity demanded would not decrease by a lot. So, goods such as milk, salt, insulin for a diabetes patient, rice, right, so many of the other millets, these are examples of necessary goods, right. So, they tend to be relatively price inelastic, right, or less elastic if you like, okay. Whereas, think of luxury goods, so necessity versus luxury, right. So, let us say a very expensive branded clothing, right, or let us say a very expensive branded watch, right. So, here these are not necessary items. So, you are going to be relatively more sensitive to an increase in the price of the good, right. So, when the price of these goods increases, your quantity demanded is going to decrease, okay. So, just keep in mind, so for example, milk or salt or grocery items, right, millets, rice, etc., right, versus let us say luxury items such as branded clothing, or let us say a luxury watch, right. So, you are going to be far more sensitive to a change in price of these goods, okay. Now, let me close this discussion by giving you one particular example. Suppose you have data given on 3 different groups of automobiles, right. So, one is what is called as the economy segment, right. Then I am going to have the mid-size sedan segment, and then you are going to have the luxury segment, right. So, suppose you have these 3 groups of automobiles, right. So, let us say you have the economy segment, you have the mid-size segment, and you have the luxury segment, okay. Now, because an automobile buying a car constitutes a large share of your budget, right? Let us not classify it as necessary or luxury good, right? It may not be a necessary good for many consumers. But irrespective of whether the car is an economy segment car or a mid-size sedan or a luxury segment, it constitutes a larger share of your budget, right? And because it constitutes a larger share of your budget, I am going to expect the price elasticity of demand to be a number which is bigger than 1, right. So, price elasticity, irrespective of which segment it belongs to, the absolute value of E is going to be bigger than 1, because a car comprises a larger share of the budget, right, which is also why a consumer also plans or shops around, right. You will look at different models, you will look at different features of the car, you will go to different dealers, you will compare prices, and only then you will take an informed decision, right. So, I know that for all of these segments, I would have expected a value being bigger than 1, right. But now, if I were to compare the values among these different segments, right. So, can I say, so for example, should the value of E for an economy sized segment car be larger than that for a mid-sized sedan segment, be larger than that for a luxury segment, right. Now, so you are comparing, so you know that all the values are going to be bigger than 1. Well, is this a number, is the absolute value here a number of the order of, let us say, 6.3, whereas for a mid-sized segment is it of the order, let us say, 2.46, and I am just making up some numbers, and for a luxury segment, let us say, is it 1.38, right. So, there notice I need to now think about availability of substitutes. More the substitutes available for a particular segment of a car, greater will be the price elasticity of demand. And notice between the three groups, the number of substitutes available will be more in the economy size segment. So, for example, if I am looking at the economy size segment cars, I will have, let us say, a WagonR, right, an i10, I will have a Tata Punch, there might be a Renault car, right. So, there are multiple cars available, so more substitutes available. For this particular segment, right. At the other extreme, if you go to the luxury segment, right, the number of substitutes available for the consumer is not substantially high. There may be substitutes, but possibly about 2 or 3. So, for example, think of a BMW or a Lexus, right. So, these are the substitutes available, very few substitutes available. So, I will just write it as very few substitutes available. Well, this is not to be confused with the first point, less the substitutes available, more inelastic the good is. But here notice, for all the 3 segments, I know that the absolute value of E is going to be bigger than 1, because a car is going to comprise a larger share of your expenditure, right. So, by that rule, the value of E is going to be a number bigger than 1 for all the 3 cases. But for the last segment, very few substitutes are available. So, compared to the economy size segment, I will expect a value of E to be much smaller. And in the mid-size sedan segment, you are going to have substitutes which are not many and which are not also very few. So, there are moderate number of substitutes available. Moderate number of substitutes available. For example, you could have a Honda City, right, a Verna or a Ciaz, right. So, I am listing a few models. So, between the 3, the highest value of E is going to be for this particular segment, a number bigger than 1, a more moderate value here, and a relatively smaller value here. Though keep in mind that all the values are going to be numbers which are bigger than 1. But if I wanted to compare between these three segments, I am going to see the highest value of E for the economy size segment, followed by the mid-size sedan segment, followed by the luxury segment. So, this completes our discussion on price elasticity of demand. We have spent some time working through examples and also understanding what are factors that affect the price elasticity of demand. Our next topic will be the introduction of a new tool which is called marginal analysis. We will talk about marginal analysis in our next lecture. Thank you.